They warned me to stay away from her, but the alien queen sat next to me instead. It all began with a simple message. Not a declaration of war, not a threat, but a warning. A warning so unexpected that humanity didn't know how to respond to it. You've messed with us, now you'll regret it. At first, Earth didn't even believe it. A message from the stars, an uncharted part of the galaxy. Surely this had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, or perhaps the work of some overzealous alien prankster. But the message was too direct, too clear to ignore. And when the coordinates were traced, the true weight of the situation began to sink in. The message had come from the Keelerans, a race so old that their history outlasted the earliest human civilizations. They had lived for centuries, their empire spanning multiple galaxies, untouched by time. Their queen, Lysara Vale, ruled with absolute authority. Her reign was marked not by mercy but by a rigid, emotionless control that had lasted for 50 years. She was not a queen in the traditional sense. She was the embodiment of the throne itself, the unyielding force that kept her empire intact. And now, for reasons no one could understand, the Keelerans had decided humanity was a threat. The reason behind their sudden interest in Earth wasn't some military campaign or grand invasion. It was something far more unexpected. Humanity had mined a small, distant asteroid, a resource that the Keelerans had once thought unimportant. The Keelerans had been watching from afar, observing humanity's slow progress, and their reaction to this small but bold act was swift and unforgiving. They had sent a message, and that message was clear. You've messed with us. Ambassador Dante Rivera, one of Earth's finest diplomats, was tasked with addressing this unanticipated crisis. His mission was simple, or so it seemed at first: open communication, avoid escalation, and somehow convince the Keelerans to overlook humanity's apparent mistake. But even as he readied himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a diplomatic faux pas. This was something far deeper, something more dangerous. The Keelerans didn't make mistakes. And they certainly didn't forgive them. Standing in the briefing room, Dante's fingers lingered over the holographic display of Queen Lysara, the ruler of the Keeleran Empire. The image of her was unlike anything he'd ever seen. She wasn't just a queen, she was a force, a presence that seemed to absorb all light in the room. Her skin shimmered a cold silver blue, an indication of the emotional control she wielded. The glowing violet eyes locked onto him through the projection, as if they could pierce through his very soul. Her robes were made of what seemed to be woven starlight itself, cascading around her in a way that made her look less like a ruler and more like an untouchable deity. Dante's training had prepared him for many things: political intrigue, hostile negotiations, even wars. But nothing had prepared him for the challenge of facing a queen who had ruled her people with such unwavering coldness. He had been told the stories. The Keelerans didn't do negotiation. They didn't do concessions. The only thing they did was rule with a strict hand that left no room for error. And the queen, she was untouchable. Her detachment was a form of power, one that had kept her empire intact for longer than any human civilization had existed. Do not attempt to treat her as you would a normal ruler, ambassador. She is not like the others you've met. Morgan, Dante's chief advisor, had warned him countless times. The Keelerans' reputation was one of perfection. The queen's emotional control was legendary, and human emotions, especially curiosity, were seen as weak, unworthy. The queen was a person to be understood. She was a symbol to be obeyed. But there was something about the message, something in the way it had been delivered, that made Dante pause. Why would a race as old and advanced as the Keelerans waste their time with a species as young as humanity? And more importantly, what did they mean by, "You've messed with us"? He had no answers yet, but one thing was certain: this wasn't just a diplomatic assignment. It was a battle of wills. A battle for survival, for the fate of Earth and its place in the galaxy. The time for diplomacy was running out. As Dante stepped onto the Keeleran embassy ship, the weight of what he was about to face pressed down on him. The vast emptiness of space surrounded him, and as he looked out into the endless void, he couldn't help but feel the chill of uncertainty creeping in. His first meeting with the Queen was only hours away. No one knew what would happen next. Would the Keelerans accept humanity's apology? Or would they deliver the punishment they had promised in that chilling message? Ambassador Rivera wasn't sure, but he knew this. Whatever came next, Earth's future depended on his ability to navigate a galaxy filled with ancient powers, where the stakes were far higher than anyone had anticipated. The unexpected war had begun, and its first casualty might just be the fragile peace humanity had worked so hard to maintain. But as the ship sailed toward the heart of the Keeleran Empire, one question echoed in Dante's mind. Would he survive the Queen's wrath? The Queen's gaze. The Keeleran Palace was unlike anything Dante Rivera had ever seen. He had imagined it grand, of course, but nothing in his briefing could prepare him for the sheer magnitude of it. The towering spires of gleaming metal, the vast halls filled with bioluminescent crystal columns that seemed to pulse with life, and the eerie silence that permeated every corner. It was as if the entire palace existed in a space untouched by time, suspended in an atmosphere of solemn reverence. The air felt thick with centuries of tradition, the weight of history pressing down on him from every direction. Dante's footsteps echoed through the hall as he walked beside Morgan, his chief advisor, who appeared more on edge with every step. Morgan had insisted on accompanying him, an extra layer of security, she called it, though Dante suspected it was more for her peace of mind than his own. He could see her eyes darting nervously between the alien dignitaries gathered in the hall. It was clear that this wasn't just any diplomatic mission. This was the Keeleran Empire, the very heart of a civilization that had survived for millennia by remaining aloof and detached from the rest of the galaxy. "Keep your posture straight," Morgan whispered, voice tense. "Remember, don't make any sudden moves, and above all, don't look directly at the Queen unless she commands it." Dante nodded, though a small part of him was starting to wonder if this whole assignment wasn't a colossal mistake. The Keelerans were known for their emotional distance, their cold perfection, and their complete lack of interest in anything outside their own empire. They didn't welcome guests, and they certainly didn't negotiate with newcomers. What had he gotten himself into? Ahead of them the throne room loomed, a massive circular space, its high ceiling disappearing into shadows. The floor was made of a polished stone that reflected the light from the crystals embedded in the walls, creating an illusion that the entire room floated in space. Hundreds of Keeleran nobles stood around the perimeter, their eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Each one was tall, their skin shifting subtly with their emotions, blue for calm, green for irritation, purple for intrigue. But it wasn't the nobles that caught Dante's attention. It was the figure seated on the throne at the center of it all. Queen Lysara. She was everything the briefing had warned him about, and yet so much more. Her skin shimmered a cold, almost metallic blue, the very image of control. She sat high upon her throne, her posture perfect, her robes cascading around her in ethereal folds of shimmering fabric. Her eyes, violet, glowing with the faintest hint of ancient wisdom, swept across the room, but there was no warmth in them, no recognition, just the detached gaze of someone who had ruled for over 5 decades, untouched by the concerns of those around her. Her presence was so overwhelming that Dante felt a flicker of doubt rise within him. Could he really do this? Could he stand before a ruler who had never shown a single ounce of emotion, let alone compassion? The ambassador from Earth approaches. A voice like chimes echoed through the hall as a Keeleran attendant announced Dante's arrival. The entire assembly bowed in unison, and Dante, following protocol, lowered his head respectfully. His eyes stayed on the floor, never daring to meet the Queen's gaze. He could feel the weight of her attention on him, though he dared not look up. In the silence that followed, every second stretched out like an eternity. Then, as if on cue, Queen Lysara's voice broke the silence. It was soft yet commanding, a voice that carried effortlessly across the room. "Rise, Ambassador Rivera." Dante straightened slowly, careful not to appear too eager, too relaxed. The air around him felt heavy, thick with the sense that every move he made would be scrutinized, every word he spoke weighed and measured. He could feel the eyes of the entire assembly on him, watching to see how he would handle this delicate situation. When he did finally raise his gaze, it was only to the level of the Queen's throne, never quite meeting her eyes. And yet, somehow, he felt as if she could see straight through him. There was a sharpness in her expression, an unreadable intensity that made it impossible to discern what she was truly thinking. "Ambassador Rivera of Earth, you stand before the throne of the Keeleran Empire." Her voice was even, detached, royal. "You come uninvited, unbidden, and yet here you are, seeking to represent your species in a matter you do not understand. Do you truly believe you can negotiate with me, Ambassador?" The words were measured, but Dante could hear the challenge beneath them, like a warning masked as a question. Dante's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had prepared for this. He had rehearsed the speech, memorized the protocol, and anticipated the Queen's questions. But nothing could have prepared him for the way she made him feel, small, insignificant, like an insect under the gaze of a predator. "I come with no intention to challenge, Your Majesty," Dante said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Only to open a dialogue, to offer humanity's apology for the misunderstanding that occurred. We never intended to disrespect the Keeleran Empire." The Queen's eyes flickered briefly, and for a split second Dante thought he saw something human, pass over her face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same impassive expression she had worn since entering the hall. But it was enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to her than the perfect, emotionless figure the Keelerans had made her out to be. And then it happened. In a move that defied every bit of protocol, Lysara's skin changed. It wasn't much, a brief flicker from blue to a softer, almost golden hue. It was so subtle that Dante almost missed it, but it was there. And in that fleeting moment, something shifted. Her expression softened ever so slightly, though her eyes remained unreadable. She spoke again, but this time, her tone was different. There was a note of curiosity in it. "Perhaps you are not as foolish as you appear, Ambassador. We shall see." Dante stood still, his mind racing. He couldn't help but wonder if he had just done the impossible, if, against all odds, he had made a connection with the Queen. But it was far too early to tell. The unlikely opening. Dante's mind raced as he stood before Queen Lysara. Her presence was still overwhelming, but now something had changed. Her skin, once cool and silver, had shifted to a softer golden hue. It wasn't a dramatic change, but in the cold, calculated world of Keeleran protocol, it was as significant as a thunderclap. Dante stood motionless, unsure if he had somehow crossed a line or if, by some miracle, he had made the smallest crack in the Queen's perfect facade. No one had ever seen Lysara show the slightest sign of emotion. Yet here she was, reacting. He swallowed, fighting the urge to speak too quickly. Instead, he kept his posture straight, his hands clasped respectfully behind his back as he waited for the Queen to speak again. The entire hall remained silent, watching every movement, every subtle shift. Even the Keeleran nobles, usually so composed, seemed to hold their breath. Queen Lysara's voice, when it came, was soft but carried authority. It was the kind of voice that made you feel like she could strip away every ounce of your dignity with a single word. But this time it was different. It was laced with something Dante couldn't quite place, something almost human. "I find myself intrigued, Ambassador Rivera," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You speak with sincerity, but do you truly believe that your apology will erase the violation your people have caused?" Dante took a steadying breath. This was his chance. He had to show her that humanity was more than the simple species she thought it was, more than the one-dimensional beings she had dismissed as unworthy of attention. "I do not expect my words to erase the past, Your Majesty," Dante replied, carefully choosing each word. "I only hope to offer the possibility of a future where we can learn from our mistakes and find common ground. We are not perfect, but we have learned that cooperation, not conflict, moves us forward." There it was, the first genuine, human response he could offer. But even as the words left his mouth, he was acutely aware of how inadequate they must sound in this room full of ancient, powerful beings. How could his words, simple and full of hope, resonate with a queen who had lived for centuries? For a moment, the queen didn't respond. Her gaze swept over him, but this time it didn't feel like a clinical examination. It was searching, searching for something she might never have thought to find in a human. And then something remarkable happened. For the briefest of moments, Lysara's eyes softened, just a little. The cool, distant mask that had defined her for decades flickered. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was as though she were considering something, something that had been buried deep within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long. Her voice broke the silence again, quieter this time. "You would have me believe that your species, so young and untested, is capable of understanding the value of diplomacy, of compassion." Dante felt his chest tighten. He couldn't lie to her. He couldn't pretend humanity was perfect. He'd seen its flaws, its mistakes, its wars. But he had also seen humanity's potential, its capacity for growth, for learning, for change. And he believed that, despite their imperfections, they were worth giving a chance. "We are flawed, Your Majesty," he said softly. "But we are also capable of extraordinary things. We've made mistakes, yes. But we've also found ways to work together across vast distances, to heal wounds, to build connections where none seemed possible." Lysara regarded him silently for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Dante couldn't tell if she was about to dismiss him, to banish him from her presence as so many before him had feared, or if she was about to do something no one had expected, allow him in. And then unexpectedly she moved. Lysara stood from her throne, the motion fluid and effortless. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the kind of gravity that made everyone in the room pause. The air seemed to thicken as the queen descended from her elevated seat, her robes flowing behind her like liquid shadows. Dante instinctively took a step back, but she didn't look down at him. She simply walked past him, her gaze fixed ahead. The crowd parted before her, parting like the sea for a force of nature. And then, just as unexpectedly, she stopped. Right in front of Dante, close, too close for comfort. Her violet eyes met his with an intensity that took his breath away. "You are not like the others, Ambassador Rivera," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of centuries. "Most of your kind would have groveled, pleaded for forgiveness. But you speak with something more, something real. Perhaps that is what has intrigued me." Dante's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. The words were a challenge, a test, and he had no intention of backing down. "I believe that real change comes from understanding, not submission," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "And I hope we can start with that understanding." For a moment, Lysara said nothing. Her skin shifted imperceptibly, a flicker of warmth that Dante couldn't fully interpret. But in that brief instant, he sensed something deep beneath the surface, something human. And then, just as quickly, her face returned to its regal, impassive state. "Perhaps," her voice was once again cool, distant, "but you have much to prove, Ambassador." The tension in the room snapped back into place. The Keeleran nobles who had been watching closely resumed their impassive stares, as if the brief moment of connection had never happened. But for Dante, it had. He had glimpsed the queen beneath the mask. Just for a moment, but enough to see that, maybe, there was hope for diplomacy after all. "We will see if your words are more than just promises, Ambassador," Lysara said, turning away from him with the same cold grace. "For now, You will remain as an observer. We shall convene the council tomorrow. Perhaps there you will earn your place." With that, she ascended back to her throne, her gaze never once looking back at him. The hall remained silent, and Dante, his pulse still racing, took his place by the side. His role had just shifted from mere ambassador to something far more dangerous, a possible ally or a potential enemy. But for the first time since he had arrived, Dante felt something more than fear. He felt possibility. The unseen thread. Dante had always prided himself on his ability to read a room, to feel the undercurrents of tension that lay just beneath the surface of any diplomatic gathering. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for the Queen court. The air in the council chamber was thick with a palpable weight, the kind that made even breathing feel like a carefully calculated move. Here, every glance, every word, every shift of posture was scrutinized, dissected, and weighed for meaning. The Queen Council was an ancient institution, one that had existed for centuries, carefully preserving the balance of power in an empire that spanned the stars. The 7 advisors seated at the table had been with Queen Lysara for decades. Each one was a master of their domain, experts in everything from military strategy to resource management. And they had ruled with her, maintaining a system of cold, logical control that had been the foundation of their empire for longer than humanity had even known how to build spacecraft. And yet, as Dante took his seat at the far end of the table, unofficially invited, but there nonetheless, the silence was almost unbearable. The Queen had made a rare decision, to allow a human ambassador into their inner sanctum to participate in their most sacred debates. There was a flicker of intrigue in her eyes when she'd invited him, but now, surrounded by the council's most influential figures, that intrigue felt like a far-off thing, distant, buried beneath layers of protocol and expectation. Ambassador Rivera, the voice of Advisor Time, cut through the tension, as sharp and crisp as a blade. He was the oldest among the advisors, his skin a deep, shimmering red that betrayed his irritation, his gaze fixed on Dante, sizing him up like an intruder in his midst. "Your presence here is unorthodox, but perhaps you have something to offer. Let's see if your human perspective can be of value." Dante took a deep breath, his fingers pressing lightly against the cool surface of the table. The words from his briefing echoed in his mind. Don't overstate your position. Don't act too familiar. He was an outsider here, and the last thing he needed was to give them more reasons to dismiss him. "I will listen carefully," Dante said, his voice steady, "and I'll offer any insights that might be useful to our discussion." The advisors exchanged glances. Lysara, seated at the head of the table, said nothing, her gaze fixed on the group with the impassive focus that had become her signature. Her skin was the same cold silver blue as it had been the day he'd first met her, an outward sign of her emotional control. But beneath that surface, Dante could sense something, a faint shift, a subtle change in her presence, as though she was watching, waiting for something to happen. The council session began. One by one, the advisors presented their reports, speaking with practiced ease. Each discussion was like a carefully choreographed dance, with words chosen to avoid offense, movements controlled to maintain authority. There was a strict hierarchy in the room, and every participant knew their place. Dante listened closely, trying to follow the complex topics being discussed: military deployments, trade routes, resource management. Each word was laden with the weight of centuries of tradition, the consequences of any decision rippling out across the empire. But as the hours passed, Dante's mind began to wander. He had always been good at reading people, but here, the Keelerans were like locked doors, unyielding, resistant to any form of understanding. Their discussions were brilliant, no doubt, but they felt cold, detached. There was no passion, no life in their words, only endless calculations of what was most efficient, what was most profitable, what would maintain the balance of power. It was then that Dante realized something he had missed earlier. Lysara wasn't just the queen. She wasn't just an unapproachable figure at the head of the table. She was trapped in this system too, trapped by the same cold logic that defined her empire. Her expression never changed as the debates continued, her posture as perfect as ever, but Dante noticed the small details, the subtle flickers in her skin. It wasn't much, but it was there. A brief darkening when military action was discussed, a slight tightening of her jaw when a particularly complex trade deal was presented. She was reacting barely, but still reacting. Beneath the ice there was something. And that's when he saw it, the smallest opening, the faintest thread of possibility. Advisor Tyne was mid-sentence when Dante found his voice. "If I may," Dante interjected, his words breaking the rhythm of the conversation. The room fell silent and the advisors turned to him, their expressions unreadable. Even Lysara's eyes briefly flickered toward him, though she didn't move. The faintest shimmer in her skin told him she was watching him, waiting. "I've been listening carefully," Dante continued, his voice now carrying a confidence that surprised even him. "The problem isn't just efficiency or strategy. It's the human element that's missing from these discussions. People, your citizens, are more than just resources to be managed. You speak of trade routes and military power, but what of the social fabric that holds an empire together? Without the connection between your people, everything else will fall apart." The room was still. Dante could feel the weight of every eye upon him, but he held his ground. He could see Lysara's expression flicker ever so slightly, her skin warming just a fraction. A sign. A sign that he had touched on something important. "Are you suggesting that we should focus on something as trivial as emotion in the governance of an empire?" Advisor Tyne's voice was harsh, a low growl of disbelief. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm suggesting that without understanding what your people truly need, without listening to their concerns, even the most efficient systems will crumble under the pressure of dissatisfaction," Dante said, his voice steady. "Human history has shown us that time and time again. The greatest empires fall not because of a lack of resources, but because they failed to connect with their people." A murmur rippled through the council. Dante knew he had pushed them, challenged their entire way of thinking. He could see the tension building, a slow, simmering reaction to his words. And yet there was a change in Lysara's demeanor. Her eyes, though still cool, seemed less distant, less removed from the conversation. She was listening. "Fascinating," Lysara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. "You speak of a principle we have long forgotten. Perhaps there is merit in considering the human perspective after all." Dante's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the opening he had hoped to find. But it wasn't just about making a point. It was about showing them that the future didn't have to be built on the cold, emotionless systems that had worked for centuries. It could be something else, something better. The room fell into silence once more. The Keelerans were not accustomed to being challenged, but now the challenge had been set. And Queen Lysara, for the first time, was considering it. A dangerous dance. The council room had never felt this alive. It wasn't because the debates were any more animated, far from it. The Keelerans spoke with their usual measured precision, their voices cold and deliberate. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Something unspoken. Dante Rivera could feel it in the air, an almost electric tension that rippled through the room. For the first time since his arrival on Kelara Prime, Queen Lysara was not simply observing. She was engaged, not with her usual detachment, but with the kind of quiet focus that made Dante wonder if the centuries-old queen was actually beginning to understand what he had been trying to show her all along, that there was more to leadership than cold, emotionless governance. Dante sat quietly at the edge of the council table, his mind racing. He had spent years honing his diplomatic skills, studying the finer points of negotiation, trying to read the subtle body language of alien species and understanding their cultural norms. But here, in the presence of the Keelerans, nothing had prepared him for this moment. The queen, who had ruled for 50 years with absolute control, was not just listening to his words, she was considering them. And that was both a privilege and a risk. As the discussions dragged on, Dante noticed Lysara's skin flicker from its usual silver blue to a warmer hue. It was so subtle he almost missed it, but it wasn't the kind of reaction that happened by accident. Every Keelerin reaction was a message, a deliberate choice. And for her skin to change in the middle of a session, especially one as formal as this, was a quiet but undeniable sign of shifting tides. His heart beat a little faster. Advisor Tyne was mid-sentence again, outlining a particularly harsh strategy for dealing with a political faction on the Outer Rim. His words were calculated, full of the cold logic that had defined Keelerin politics for centuries. But there was something in the air that made Dante uneasy. It wasn't the suggestion itself. It was the way it was being delivered. A cold solution for a cold problem. No room for understanding, no consideration for the lives affected. It was a mindset Dante had seen far too often in his travels across the galaxy, and it unsettled him. "We must secure the Outer Rim," Tyne was saying, his voice dripping with authority. "And we will do so at whatever cost. Our fleets are ready, and the resources we need to consolidate this region are already in motion. If they resist, we will crush them with our superior force. It is the only way to maintain stability." The other advisors nodded in agreement, but Dante couldn't stay silent. The tone in the room had turned too familiar, too cold. "What's the cost of that stability?" Dante asked, his voice calm but firm. The room stilled, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. For a brief moment, the advisors exchanged looks. They had never expected a human ambassador to question the wisdom of a Keelerin advisor, especially not in a council session as critical as this one. "What do you mean, ambassador?" Tyne asked, his tone laced with irritation, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "The cost is irrelevant. The Empire's security is at stake." "The cost is never irrelevant," Dante replied. "You're speaking of stability, but at what cost? The people in the Outer Rim are not just resources to be controlled. They are individuals, families, citizens of your empire. If you crush them, you risk losing the very thing you're trying to protect: loyalty, trust, the foundation that holds this empire together. Without that, there is no stability, only fear." There was an audible shift in the room, a subtle tension that rippled through the assembled advisors. They were unused to hearing such sentiments from anyone, let alone a human. Dante could feel the eyes of every Keelerin in the room on him, their scrutiny intense. And then, to his surprise, Lysara spoke. Her voice, as always, was controlled, but there was a new edge to it, a slight change in the way she carried herself. "You speak of loyalty, Ambassador Rivera," she said, her violet eyes fixed on him, her tone a mixture of curiosity and command. "But loyalty cannot be bought with kindness alone. You cannot persuade everyone with words. There are times when strength must prevail." Dante felt the weight of her words, but he did not back down. "Strength is important, Your Majesty, but strength without compassion is a blade with no purpose. You risk severing the very connections that make your empire strong. Strength is not only in the weapon you wield, but in the bonds you create. If you treat people as nothing more than pawns on a board, you'll soon find that those pawns will rise against you." The room was still. Tyne's expression darkened, his skin flickering between red and green, a mix of irritation and suppressed frustration. But it was Lysara's reaction that caught Dante off guard. Her skin shimmered ever so slightly, a change that indicated something deeper, an awareness that he wasn't just speaking in theory, but in something she understood on a more personal level. "You may be right, Ambassador," Lysara said slowly, her gaze lingering on him. "But I have lived for 50 years under the assumption that what you speak of is a luxury we cannot afford. The Empire is vast. There are too many threats, too many forces at play. One misstep and everything could fall apart. But perhaps," she trailed off, her gaze flickering briefly to her council members, "perhaps there is a balance to be found." Dante's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a diplomatic conversation anymore. Lysara was considering his words not just as a ruler but as a ruler caught between the weight of duty and the truth in his message. She wasn't just the queen of an empire. She was a person who had lived in isolation, who had been bound by rules and expectations for half a century. And for the first time, it seemed like she was considering something else, a different way. Before anyone could respond, Lysara stood, her motion smooth and deliberate. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She moved toward the far side of the council chamber, her robes flowing behind her like liquid starlight. The advisors watched, their expressions unreadable, but Dante couldn't tear his eyes away from the queen. Her figure was regal, commanding, yet there was a softness now, something human that had been hidden beneath layers of centuries-old tradition. "I will think on what you have said, Ambassador Rivera," she said, her voice carrying through the silence. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps there is more to strength than what I have believed." With that she turned, her skin shifting once again, this time to a soft amber, a hue that spoke of reflection, of the beginnings of change. She met Dante's gaze, and for the first time there was something more than cold authority in her eyes. There was curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, there was the first hint of hope. Shifting alliances. The Keelerin Palace had never felt as still as it did in the days following the council meeting. Dante Rivera could feel the weight of the silence in the corridors, a silence that was both uncomfortable and telling. It wasn't just the quiet that was strange. It was the sense that something had changed. Queen Lysara had stepped away from the council session after that unusual exchange. Her behavior was a departure from the rigid, emotionless figure she had always presented. There was a new uncertainty in her movements, a crack in the flawless armor of her leadership that Dante hadn't expected to see. It wasn't just her skin flickering between hues of silver, amber, and gold. It was the way her eyes lingered on him, the way she seemed to study him, as though she was searching for something. Something she had lost. It was the first time Dante had felt the faintest hint of something more than duty in her gaze. It wasn't softness, but it was real. The queen, who had once seemed as impervious as a mountain, was beginning to reveal the cracks in her stone facade. And as much as Dante felt a sense of victory in that small shift, it also terrified him. As he walked through the quiet halls of the palace, he couldn't help but wonder, what happens next? The next day, Dante was summoned to another private council session. This time, however, it wasn't just a formality. Lysara had personally requested his presence again, not as an observer but as a participant. It was a rare move, one that suggested she was seriously considering his influence in their discussions. But it also meant that the stakes were higher. He wasn't just an ambassador anymore. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. He entered the chamber cautiously, his heart beating in time with each step. Lysara was seated at the head of the table, her posture regal as ever, but there was something different about the way she held herself. Her expression was no longer the mask of untouchable authority. It was something more human. Her skin was a warm gold now, a color that indicated both confidence and curiosity. The council members, usually poised and detached, sat silently, their eyes flickering between each other and then back to Dante. The air was thick with anticipation, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him to speak, to break the silence. Lysara's voice broke through the tension, her tone uncharacteristically soft. "Ambassador Rivera," she said, looking directly at him, "you have asked us to consider new perspectives, to challenge long-standing practices, and yet you yourself are an enigma, a human who dares to question us, to suggest a different path. What makes you believe you can change centuries of tradition?" Her words were not hostile. In fact, there was a hint of something else in them, something like an invitation. She was testing him, yes, but there was something else beneath that steel exterior. Respect, perhaps even genuine interest. Dante swallowed hard. This wasn't like the last time. There were no rehearsed lines, no diplomatic tactics he could rely on. This was personal. because I believe that strength isn't just about dominance or control, Your Majesty." His voice was steady, though his mind raced to find the right words. "Strength comes from connection, from knowing that the people you rule over trust you, respect you. If you govern only by force, you build walls around yourself, walls that isolate you from the very people you seek to protect." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But if you govern with understanding, with empathy, you create bonds. And bonds are what truly hold an empire together." Lysara's gaze never wavered, but Dante could see the flicker in her eyes. The slightest shift of emotion, just a hint. She was listening, really listening. For the first time since arriving on Kelara Prime, he could feel the Queen's attention was more than a mere observation. It was engagement. The room seemed to hold its breath, and for a long moment no one spoke. The silence stretched out, but Dante didn't break eye contact with Lysara. It felt like a test, a dangerous one that could unravel everything he had worked for. But he didn't back down, not now. Finally, Lysara spoke, her voice low and measured. "You speak of connection, ambassador, of bonds, but there is a difference between theory and reality." She stood, her robes flowing behind her like liquid starlight. She stepped closer to him, her height towering above him as she moved across the chamber. The space between them felt charged, like a magnetic force pulling them together. "We Keelerans have governed for millennia by upholding the ideals of detachment, by placing the empire above all else. You speak of empathy as if it is a simple choice. But for us it is a sacrifice, the loss of control, the loss of authority. The moment you begin to connect with others, you risk vulnerability, and in our position, vulnerability is something we cannot afford." Dante took a step forward, meeting her halfway. He understood what she was saying. Her position was impossible. She had ruled for so long, her entire identity wrapped in the mantle of the throne, that stepping down from that pedestal, allowing herself to feel, was a dangerous gamble. She had isolated herself for years, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of choice. But it was clear that her way of ruling was no longer sustainable. She knew it, and Dante was the one pushing her to confront it. "I understand that, Your Majesty." His voice softened, but there was an urgency in it now. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice your power. I'm asking you to let it evolve. Strength doesn't have to come at the expense of compassion. It can come from it. The greatest leaders across history were those who understood their people, who connected with them. You don't have to lose control. You have to learn how to lead in a way that makes you stronger, not weaker." For the first time since Dante had met her, Lysara hesitated. Her eyes flickered, and in that brief moment, Dante saw something raw, a crack in the ice, something vulnerable. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough. Enough to make him realize that this wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about a queen, caught between the weight of her past and the possibility of a different future. Lysara turned away from him then, her back straight, her expression unreadable. "You speak of change, Ambassador Rivera," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I find myself intrigued. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps there is a different path. But know this, if we walk down it, there will be consequences. There will be opposition from my court, from my people, and from within myself." Dante nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was a risk, a dangerous one, but one worth taking. "I'm willing to face those consequences, Your Majesty, and I believe deep down you are too." Lysara turned back to him, her skin now a soft gold, a warmth that spoke volumes. "Then we will begin." Her voice was quiet but resolute. "But understand this, Ambassador Rivera, this is not just diplomacy anymore. This is a battle for the soul of my empire, and I am not certain if either of us is ready for what comes next." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick and heavy. This was the point of no return, and as Dante stood before her, he realized that everything he had done until now had led to this moment. The Queen had chosen a path, one that was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it was a path that could change the course of her empire, and perhaps the fate of humanity itself. The shifting tide. It was a quiet, almost surreal morning when Dante was summoned to the private gardens of the Keelerin Palace. For a brief moment, He wondered if he had somehow crossed a line, if the fragile alliance he had worked so hard to build with Queen Lysara was on the verge of unraveling. The air outside was thick with the scent of bioluminescent flowers, their colors shifting in hues that could only be described as alive. It was beautiful, yes, but it was a beauty that seemed too perfect to be real, like a dream from which one might suddenly awaken. And yet the quiet had settled on the palace, and Dante could feel it. Something had changed, something fundamental that couldn't be undone. As he walked through the winding paths of the garden, flanked by towering trees that seemed to hum with a quiet energy, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the precipice of something far larger than diplomacy. He was not just navigating the political landscape of an ancient empire anymore. He was stepping into the heart of it, right into Lysara's world, a world governed by power, fear, and the relentless need for control. Dante wasn't sure what was waiting for him in the garden, but as he approached the secluded stone bench where he had last seen Lysara, his breath caught in his throat. The queen wasn't surrounded by the usual court advisors. She was alone, her robes flowing around her like liquid night, the subtle shimmer of her skin reflecting the soft light of the morning sun. But what struck Dante more than anything was the look on her face. There was no cold mask today, no ruler's armor. There was a weariness in her expression, something that made her look human for the first time. Ambassador Rivera. Lysara's voice was softer than he had ever heard it, her tone stripped of formality. She wasn't just a queen now, she was a person. And she was waiting for him, not as a diplomat, but as someone who had crossed into a more dangerous territory. The space between them felt charged with a quiet understanding. Dante stopped a few paces away, unsure of how to proceed. He had never seen her like this, and the change was both unnerving and oddly reassuring. "Your Majesty," he replied, his voice calm but with an edge of uncertainty. I wasn't expecting this. Is everything all right?" Yes. She gestured for him to sit, her hands folding delicately in her lap. "Everything is complicated, Ambassador." There was a subtle pause as she collected her thoughts, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. "You've pushed me to a place I never thought I'd be. A place where I have to decide what kind of ruler I want to be. But it's more than that now. It's about who I am." Dante took a step closer, cautiously lowering himself onto the stone bench beside her. The space between them was intimate in a way that shouldn't have felt possible for a queen and her ambassador. But here, in this strange moment of vulnerability, it felt like they were equals. Not in title, perhaps, but in experience. "I didn't mean to push you, Lysara," Dante said, using her name for the first time. It was a small thing, but the weight of it wasn't lost on him. She had invited him here, not as an emissary, but as a person. "I only wanted to help you see that you didn't have to choose between your empire and yourself, that there could be a way to lead with both strength and compassion." Lysara's gaze shifted away, her eyes drifting to the horizon, where the sun cast a soft golden light over the palace grounds. "Strength, compassion, they are not so easily reconciled, Ambassador." Her voice was distant now, as if she were reflecting on something far deeper. "For 50 years I have ruled without allowing myself the luxury of choice. I made my decisions based on what was best for the empire, but at the cost of who I am. I have ruled as the throne itself, not as a person." Dante's heart tightened. He understood. She had lived for so long in the isolation of her role that to let anyone see her as more than a queen was a terrifying, almost impossible act. But she was starting to understand the truth. She was more than just a ruler. She was a person, fragile, complex, and capable of feeling the same doubts and fears that anyone could. "And now," Dante asked gently, his voice quiet but steady, "what will you do now, Lysara?" Lysara turned to face him, her eyes filled with an intensity that spoke volumes. For the first time, there was no trace of cold calculation in her gaze, only raw honesty. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can balance the two parts of myself, the queen who must always remain above it all, and the person who longs for something more, something real." There was a vulnerability in her words that Dante hadn't expected. The queen, who had held an empire together for decades, was unsure of herself. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was a strength that only those who had lived through isolation could understand. I think, Dante began carefully, choosing his words with the kind of caution that came from knowing just how high the stakes were. I think that you've already started, Lysara. You've already made the hardest choice. You've allowed yourself to feel again, and that's something most leaders could never do. Lysara remained silent, but her skin shifted ever so slightly, a warm amber glow that betrayed her thoughts. The small, almost imperceptible change was enough to tell Dante that, despite her doubts, she was beginning to consider the possibility of balance, of blending the throne with the person behind it. And maybe, just maybe, it was something that could work. "But what about your court?" Dante asked, his voice low. "What about those who depend on you to remain steadfast, unyielding?" The question hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of their situation. Lysara's gaze turned hard again, her expression hardening into the mask of the queen. "They will have to accept what comes. If they are loyal to me, they will support the changes. But if they are loyal to the throne alone," she trailed off, her words left unfinished. Dante nodded, sensing that the road ahead would not be easy. The political ramifications of Lysara's decisions would be vast. Her advisors, her people, the very structure of her empire, everything would be tested. But what Lysara had done in this moment was monumental. She had chosen to be more than just a figurehead. She had chosen to be human. "Then let's walk this path together," Dante said softly. "Whatever happens, you won't be alone." Lysara looked at him, and for the first time there was no mask. There was only the queen and the person she was choosing to become. Her skin warmed to copper, a color that spoke of trust, of connection, of a choice made. "Thank you, Ambassador Rivera," she said, her voice sincere. "You have shown me that there is strength in being human, in being seen." And as they sat together in the warmth of the garden, surrounded by the gentle hum of the Keeleran world, Dante realized that the most powerful thing a ruler could do was to admit that they didn't have all the answers, that they could choose change, that they could evolve. And for Lysara, that choice had just begun. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more amazing videos.